Hey everyone, welcome to Our Small Footprint. So it is Sunday morning and I'm filming this intro for the video. Yesterday I did a whole day of apple processing and I had intended that to be today's video, but when I went to edit it I realized that I actually have missed a day of sharing some footage, and that footage is important for yesterday's video. So this is, I think, Friday, and I made apple butter barbecue sauce and smoked a pork and apple butter and things like that, which was sort of a small prep day before the big apple prep day. So I am going to share that one today, and I'll share the full apple day tomorrow. Now I am hoping to have a sit down today or tomorrow. It really just depends on when I get to it, and have a chat with you about where we are at mid-month. So we're sort of mid-ish month, not quite I don't think, but close to all the planning and everything else. I've set my dates for my next grocery run and organised some other things to pick up and that sort of stuff. So I'll sit down and have a chat with you about where we're going with all of that. In sometime during this week I'll release that as a video, but for now this is some apple prep amongst other things, and I believe this was Friday, and then tomorrow I will share yesterday's video with the whole day of apples. So I think I've gotten through about 60 kilos so far of the 180 kilos of apples, so I've still got a way to go, but at least I've made progress. Alrighty guys, I will see you again tomorrow. Enjoy watching. We started the morning off with Dutch Baby Pancakes again. The kids had really enjoyed them the other morning, and we still had a couple of jars of the apple pie filling that had failed left in the fridge to be used up. So we decided to make another batch of those. We did the same process again. It's 18 eggs, 2 1/4 cups of flour, and 2 1/4 cups of liquid. So I weighed it this time because I prefer to weigh things than use cup measures. So it ended up being about 375 grams of plain flour, and then a 400 gram tin of coconut cream, and then I added 100 mils of water, so 500 grams of liquid all up. That seemed to work fairly well for us in the consistency wise. You have to put the butter in the pan like we discussed last time. So you put a knob of butter or ghee or fat of some sort in the pan, and then the pan goes into the oven so that that butter melts in the bottom of the pan, which means that when the batter hits it, it already starts cooking that external part of the batter, which means it doesn't stick. So once the pan was heated and the butter was melted, you pull the pan back out of the oven and you pour the batter into that fat. Carefully, of course, because it will spit and splatter if you're not too careful. So you pour that batter back into it, and as you can see, the edges already start sort of like creating a bit of a skin on it, and then you put the pan back in the oven to cook for as long as it takes until it looks cooked. It's really variable depending on the size of the pan, the thickness of the pancake, and all the rest of that. And this is what it looked like cooked for this morning. After we had breakfast, I got moving on one of the pork legs that we've got. So I diced up a large portion of it into just chunks for mincing for sausages and put that aside. I then took the skin off the rest of it. This piece I was keeping as a roast, so I just sliced the skin off and leave a little bit of fat behind to create a cap on the roast because I'm going to smoke this one. So I carefully slice all the rind off the roast and then put the roast aside, and then slice all the rind up. So I slice the rind into fairly thin strips because I find that it cooks better over the potatoes in the oven and you get more of the fat rendered off. Like mincing the fat that you buy to render down to lard, the smaller the pieces, the quicker and easier it is for that lard to render down into the pan. So I cut it into thin strips and chunks, the whole lot, and then I cut up some potatoes into fairly large chunks because you want them to cook in the same time that it takes the rind to render. So I put the potatoes in the bottom of a pan, and I fill 2 pans with potatoes because we eat them with dinner that night or with lunch or whichever meal they happen to be ready for. fill the 2 trays with the potatoes and place the rind in a single layer over the top of the potatoes. I then spray some oil over the rind and sprinkle it all with salt. The kids did help me with the salt here, and I had to take over a little bit. And then it goes in the oven to cook. Again, the time that this takes is very variable. It depends on what temperature you start on, depends on the size of your potato chunks. There's a whole lot of things, but it takes a good 30-45 minutes, the same as what it would if you were roasting potatoes. The roast I was going to put in the smoker, as I said. So what I did was I used the homemade mustard, and I created a skin over the whole roast with this mustard to create a layer of moisture, and rubbed it into all the little crevices. And because I used the strings that were on it previously, and I just tightened them as necessary to hold it together, and it creates some crevices and stuff in the bottom, so I make sure to fill all them with the mustard as well to get that flavour all the way through. And then I coated the mustard in some of the Louisiana rub that we got from the hamper. So we got 5 or 6 jars of this Louisiana rub, and it's a fairly standard sort of a blend of smoky spices. It's perfectly good. It saves me making my own while we've got it. So I covered all the mustard with that rub to create that crust on it, and then it goes into the smoker. So I put a Bluetooth probe into the middle of the meat so that I'd know when it was done. And pork is cooked at 70, I think the lowest is 68 Celsius, 150 Fahrenheit. 72 to 76 is normally where we aim. That's just a safe, well-cooked sort of a temperature, but it really just depends on how closely I watch the thing. It does have an alarm that can go to my phone, but I don't always send it, and I'm sometimes too far away for that alarm to work. So the chunks that I cut off, I seasoned so that they marinated so they can go in the fridge, and then I will mince them for sausages. I just did a really standard sort of a marinade. I didn't even really measure too much except for the salt. So you want a certain ratio of salt in the pork, which is 10 grams per kilo at a minimum. So I put salt in there. I used some of the homemade mustard. I used a whole lot of our mixed dried herbs. So I had harvested these from the garden and dried them and put them in a jar. So it's bits of rosemary, sage, thyme, marjoram maybe, just a whole bunch of green herbs, and I use this mix for a lot of different things. So I put that in there as well. I always add smoked paprika because I just really like the flavour, and I added a jar of the cowboy candy as well. So we use the brine from the cowboy candy in a lot of things that we eat, but we tend to not eat the jars of actual cowboy candy that often. So I really like to use them in things like this. They go inside my sausage mixes or things like that, and then get cooked through there. It adds a whole lot of flavour and some moisture and some acidity too. And then that just goes in the fridge until I am ready to mince it up and put it in sausage casings. The next thing I did was the apple butter barbecue. So I don't think I showed in this video for some reason how I made the apple butter. I'm not sure. So I'm going to have to look back at that when I come back to this video. So in the apple butter, I made the apple butter in the pressure cooker. I filled the pressure cooker with the whole chunks of apples, no cores, but just big chunks of apples, and then cooked it down 5 minutes at pressure, and then used an immersion blender to smooth it out. But I don't know, I'll have to look. And then I decided to make some apple butter barbecue. Now I looked at a whole bunch of recipes. There was a whole lot around, and the same basic recipe was repeated on a half a dozen pages and claiming it as their own. So I have no idea where it originates from. But I doubled it, and the double recipe was basically 16 cups of apple butter, and then 2 jars of passata, and then I used a little water in the jars to get the excess out. I then added cinnamon and garlic and salt and smoked paprika in the ratios that says. I'll put a link to one of the recipes in the bottom. It had vinegar in it. I would have liked to have used my apple cider vinegar, but I didn't have any at the time, so I used just some white vinegar, which is fine. Now, the recipe for that size called for 12 cups of sugar. I am not a big sugar user here, and our taste buds have changed accordingly, so I only put 2 cups of sugar in it and decided I'd check it when I was done. Now, sugar isn't necessary for safety of canning, it is more just for taste and look and things like that, so reducing the sugar isn't going to impact this particular recipe at all. The recipe also didn't have any molasses in it, so I added some molasses, and it didn't have any Worcestershire sauce in it either, so I added Worcestershire as well. The recipe also doesn't have any onion in it. I didn't add it because onion can affect your canning, your pH levels, so I didn't add it, but that's a little bit of a... Normally barbecue sauce would have onion in it. I don't know. Anyway, I put it on the stove and we cooked it until it got to the right consistency that we wanted. This is the pork rinds and the potatoes coming out of the oven, and what we do is we use a rack over one of the pans so that we get the potatoes and the pork up out of the fat fairly quickly, because otherwise the potatoes just absorb all the fat, and whilst that's really tasty, it defeats the purpose of trying to render that fat to keep. So we pull all the potatoes and the rind out of the pan and up on a rack above the pan so that any excess fat can drain down into the pan that we can use. Once the fat is a little cooler and the trays are a little bit easier to handle, we have a jar here that the kids and I refer to as my dirty fat jar, and this is where we put bacon fat or fat like this that's going to have little bits of food in it. So this one is it's a short-term jar. It's not something that can be stored forever because it has the opportunity to go rancid because it has those little bits of food product in it. So it's referred to in our house lovingly as the dirty fat jar. So I just poured all the fat that was in the bottom of those pans into this jar, and that will be used for cooking. It adds great flavor when you like sauteing vegetables and things like that. I got the pork out of the smoker when it was at the correct temperature and placed it in a tray and put some foil on it to let it rest and put it aside until we were ready for it later. It's always good to foil and rest smoked meat so that it doesn't seize up when you slice it. I put all the barbecue sauce into jars. Now I use half-pint jars because the kids will consume an entire jar in a sitting. So there's 6 kids, and if they were having something that they were dipping it into sauce, they will go through an entire jar. And we reckon that if I canned it in like pint jars, they would just go through a pint jar instead of a half-pint jar. So we decided to keep it on the small jars. It means we use more lids and it's a little more work, but it is portion control basically. So we put it into all these little jars, did all the usual, cleaned all the rims with vinegar, made sure to get them nice and clean. Have a variety of lids here again, so I have some mason jars and some lug lid jars here, so put the mason lids and rings on and then tightened the lug lid jars as well. You want to tighten those lug lid jars before they go in the canner. Finger tight rings on the mason jars as normal. Then they all go into the canner, and I double stacked them in mine and managed to fit them all in there in one go, which was really nice. I canned up whatever was left of the apple butter in 27s, so I just filled the jars, as many as I had left over, and I will use this either as apple butter or I could use it to make more of the apple butter barbecue later on. So I did the normal, cleaned all the rims, put the rings on, lids on and clips. These are 27s and these are Fowler's Vicola jars, and they work really well. You have to be careful with these 27s because they narrow so much at the neck. You sort of want to, I find that I have to fill them only to the shoulder. They need that neck space for expansion, otherwise they tend to siphon really badly. After that, I sliced the pork up for dinner. So this was the pork after it had rested, and it's wonderful, but we tend to eat the entire piece in 1 or 2 meals, so it's not something I always do because it uses a fair bit of meat for a single meal or two, but it is well appreciated when I do make it. So that was everything for today. Hope you enjoyed watching, and I will see you again tomorrow.